She wore a dark red dress, the color of the wine she wasn't drinking, and between us a single candle had burned down to a shallow pool of soft wax. Behind her, the Philadelphia skyline glittered through old restaurant glass I had cleaned with my own hands a long time ago. She looked down, her fingers tightening on the edge of the white napkin, and barely above a whisper she said, "Men leave when they hear I've had 3 husbands." I didn't reach for her hand. I didn't rush to fill the quiet. I waited until she lifted her eyes to mine, and I said, "You met the wrong men. My name is Elliot Shaw. I'm 35 years old, and I put old buildings back together for a living. That's the short version, the one I give at parties I don't want to stay at. The longer version is that I'm a restoration architect, which means people call me when a building is too beautiful to tear down and too broken to leave standing. I climb into attics that haven't held a footstep in 80 years. I read water stains the way other men read the morning paper. I can walk into an empty ballroom and tell you where the light used to fall before somebody bricked up the windows in 1962. It is patient work, and I am a patient man, and for a long time the two of us got along just fine. I live alone in a converted workshop on the first floor of an old print house, in a part of the city that smells like the river when the wind turns off the water. There's a single lamp over my drafting table and shelves of rolled drawings gone yellow at the edges, and the whole place carries the smell of hide glue and sawdust no matter how often I sweep. I was divorced 4 years ago. My ex-wife and I never had children, and that was one of the very few things we ever managed to agree on completely. When she left, the apartment got quieter, and I told myself I preferred it that way. Most days, I even believed it. There's a satisfaction in the work that I've never quite been able to explain to people who don't do it. You take something the whole world has decided is finished, condemned, past saving, and you get down on your knees with it, and you find out that underneath a century of neglect, the frame is still true and the timber still holds. People are surprised by how often that turns out to be the case. I stopped being surprised a long time ago. I just started believing it about buildings before I ever thought to believe it about anything else. I tell you all of this so you understand exactly the kind of ordinary evening I was expecting when Camille Ashford first called my office. She called on a Tuesday, late in the afternoon, when the light through the high windows had gone the color of weak tea. My assistant put her through, and a woman's voice, low and careful, said she had a house she needed looked at before she sold it. Her grandmother's house, up in Weybridge, about 2 hours west of the city. An old place, she said. 1880s, maybe older. She wanted someone honest to tell her whether it was worth saving, or whether she should just let the developers have it and be done. I said I could drive up that weekend. She thanked me, and there was a small pause on the line, the kind of pause most people rush to fill with weather or traffic, and she didn't fill it with anything at all. Then she said she'd found my card in her grandmother's kitchen drawer. I believed her. I had no reason not to. What I didn't say, not to her and not to my assistant and not out loud to anyone in that quiet office, was that I knew her name. I knew it the way you know a song you can't quite place, a melody that surfaces from some room in your memory you thought you'd painted over years ago. Camille Ashford. I turned it over a few times after I hung up, and then I made myself set it back down, because there are hundreds of restoration people between Philadelphia and Weybridge, and any one of them could have looked at that house. I didn't let myself wonder why a woman would drive 2 hours to hand her grandmother's home to a stranger who happened to keep an office near a highway she'd have to leave the main road to reach. I told myself it was chance. I was very good, back then, at telling myself things. So that Saturday, I loaded my truck with a flashlight and a moisture meter and a thermos of black coffee, and I drove west into a country that got greener and slower the farther I went. And somewhere along that road, without knowing it yet, I was driving straight back into the one summer I had spent 14 years pretending I had forgotten how to remember. Weybridge is the kind of town that looks like it was built for a postcard nobody ever got around to mailing. One main street, a hardware store, a white church with a bell that still keeps honest time, And there, at the end of the block, its neon half-lit, even in the daylight, the Larkspur Diner. I saw that sign before I saw anything else in town, and something in my chest went tight and old and wordless, and I did not understand why. Not then. Camille was waiting on the porch of her grandmother's house when I pulled up. She was younger than her voice had sounded on the phone, and older in the eyes than her face let on, and she stood the way careful people stand, like she'd learned the hard way that leaning on things is how you get hurt when they move. Around the porch, growing wild and unpruned, were tall spikes of blue and violet flowers, nodding in the afternoon wind. "Larkspur," she said when she caught me looking. "My grandmother planted them. They come back every year, whether anyone tends them or not." She said it lightly, but she said it the way you say a thing that has cost you something to keep believing. The house was worth saving. I knew it within 20 minutes. Good bones, honest timber, a staircase somebody had built by hand with a great deal more love than money. The floors were oak, warped and water-darkened in places but solid all the way through, and when I knelt to press my palm flat against them I could feel how much life had crossed over them. I told her the truth. I told her it would cost her more than the developers would ever offer, but that it could be beautiful again, and that some things are worth exactly the price of not letting them go. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "That's a strange thing for a man to believe about a house." We fell into a rhythm over the next several weeks. I'd drive up on the weekends to measure and photograph and test the joists, and she'd meet me there, always already on the porch, always with a fresh pot going inside, and somewhere between the readings and the notes we started, slowly, to talk. Not about the house. About everything else, the way you do when you're both quietly pretending the work is the only reason either of you keeps showing up on a Saturday morning that could have been spent anywhere at all. I noticed I was leaving earlier on those Saturdays than the drive strictly required, and staying later than the light allowed for any real measuring. I didn't examine that too closely at the time. A man tells himself he's being thorough. A man tells himself a lot of things when the truth would mean rearranging his whole careful life. She told me she'd been married 3 times. She told me the way you set down something heavy, fast, to get it over with, watching my face the whole time for the flinch she had clearly seen on other men before me. I didn't flinch, so she kept going, a little at a time, over cups of coffee gone cold on the porch rail while the larkspur swayed and the light moved across the yard. The first one, she said, married her young and was gone before she'd learned how he took his coffee. The second stayed longer and left louder, the kind of leaving that comes with a slammed drawer and a list of everything you did wrong. The third had promised, actually promised, with his hand laid over hers at a kitchen table, that he was different, that he wasn't going anywhere, and then one night he heard the whole history laid out end to end, and he was gone inside the month. She counted them off on her fingers without any drama at all, the way you'd recite a grocery list you'd said too many times to feel anymore. 3, she said, when she'd finished. People hear the number and they stop hearing anything else. The number becomes the whole story. Nobody ever asks what the number cost me. The problem isn't that they left, she said one evening, folding a paper napkin into smaller and smaller squares until it couldn't fold anymore. It's that I keep choosing men who were always going to. I wanted to argue with her. I didn't, because there's a kind of pain that doesn't want your argument, it wants your patience, and I was slowly learning to tell the two apart, so I just listened. I let her talk until the light went gold and then gray behind the trees, and I let the silences sit without trying to fix them. And I think that patience was the first thing about me she hadn't been expecting. She kept glancing at me sideways, the way you check whether a step will hold your weight before you trust it. What I couldn't have known then, what you can probably already see from where you're sitting, is that she was showing me only the outer edges of the story. She kept the whole center of it hidden in plain sight, right there in front of me. There were moments. She'd rest her hand flat against the door frame of the front room every single time she passed through it, the same worn spot, like she was greeting an old friend nobody else could see. She'd stop mid-sentence to look at the larkspur far too long, longer than a person looks at flowers they've walked past their entire life. And once, digging in her purse for her keys, she pulled out a matchbook, navy blue, worn soft at the corners, a silver sprig of larkspur printed on the cover, and the words Larkspur Diner beneath it. She looked at it for half a second, and then she pushed it back down into the bottom of her bag like it had gone hot in her hand, and she changed the subject so fast it left a mark in the air between us. I noticed. I just didn't understand. I filed it away with all the other small, strange things and told myself, again, that it wasn't any of my business. Every single time I got close, she steered us gently off the road. I asked her once, lightly, why she'd chosen me for the house, out of everyone she could have called, and she smiled and said something about the card in the drawer and asked whether the chimney could be saved. I asked her another time whether she'd grown up around here, whether the two of us might have crossed paths once, long ago, and she stood up and said she'd left the good coffee inside, and by the time she came back, the question had cooled on the rail, and I let it go, the way you let a lot of things go when you're afraid of the answer without knowing it. There was a diner in that town that tightened my chest every time I drove past it, though I'd have told you, if you'd asked, that it was just an old diner like 100 others. There was a woman who touched the same doorframe every day of her life. There was a matchbook she carried around like a stone in her shoe. And I drove home each Sunday, 2 hours east into the dark with the radio low, without ever once putting those three things in the same sentence, because some part of me already knew that if I did, the sentence would be so loud I'd never be able to unhear it. I told her the house was worth saving. I did not tell her that I was starting to think the exact same thing about a summer I'd spent 14 years deliberately living 2 hours away from, so that I would never once have to remember it. I didn't tell her, because I hadn't yet let myself know it was true. That's the thing about the truth. Sometimes it isn't hiding from you at all. Sometimes you've simply built a wall around it so carefully, so lovingly, brick by patient brick, that you've forgotten there's even a room back there. And it takes someone standing in your doorway, touching the frame like she's done it 1,000 times before, to make you finally wonder what it was you sealed away in there, and why you were so afraid of it. The developer showed up on a Thursday, and she wasn't a stranger. I was in the front room, up on a ladder checking the ceiling joists with my flashlight, when I heard the car door in the drive, and then heels on the porch boards, sharp and even, a sound that landed in my spine a full second before my brain caught up to it. I knew that walk. I turned around on the ladder, and there was Bianca, my ex-wife. 4 years since I'd watched her load her half of our life into a car in the rain, and here she was in a tailored gray coat with a leather folder tucked under her arm, standing in a farmhouse 2 hours from the city like the universe had a sense of humor I'd never been let in on. "Elliot," she said, and she smiled the way she used to smile when she'd already decided exactly how a conversation was going to end before it began. Small world. Or maybe not so small after all. It took me a few minutes to understand the shape of it. Bianca's firm was buying Weybridge, or trying to. Block by block, parcel by parcel, an entire old town quietly rezoned into a boutique hotel and a tidy row of shops for people who wanted the feeling of a place like this without the inconvenience of its actual history. And the Ashford house, the very one I'd been telling Camille was worth every dollar of saving, was the parcel her whole plan needed most. The keystone. The single stone that made the rest of the arch stand up. I was standing in the middle of her deal. Worse, from exactly where she stood, I was talking her seller out of selling. "You always did fall in love with the wrong buildings," Bianca said, walking a slow circle around the room, running one gloved finger along a windowsill and frowning at the dust it came away with. "Money on one side, a pile of rotten oak on the other, and you pick the oak every single time." She'd left me over precisely that, more or less. She'd wanted the big commercial commissions, the glass towers with my name on a brass plaque in the lobby, and I kept choosing the broken, beautiful things that never paid what they were worth. She had called it a fundamental lack of ambition. I had called it knowing what I loved. Neither one of us had been entirely wrong, if I'm honest. We'd just been wrong for each other, in a way that took years to stop aching. She could have left it at business. She didn't. Bianca has never once in her life left a single thing at business when there was a nerve still available to press. She came back the following week, and this time she made sure to find me alone, packing my gear into the bed of the truck at the end of a long day, the light going flat and orange over the fields. She had the folder with her. She set it down on the hood between us, deliberately, like a woman laying out a winning hand she'd been holding all along. "Before you go on playing the noble craftsman," she said, "you really ought to know who you're being so noble for." I should have gotten in the truck and driven away. I opened the folder instead. Inside were photographs, but not of the house. Old ones. A young woman and a young man on the front steps of the Larkspur Diner, both of them squinting into a hard summer sun. Printouts of articles about my firm, 3 of them, going back years, one so old the paper had yellowed and gone soft as cloth. A typed list of every restoration architect within 100 miles of Weybridge, a dozen names, all of them closer to that town than I was, and my own name down at the very bottom, circled twice in hard black ink. And tucked into the inside pocket of the folder, a matchbook, navy blue, a silver sprig of larkspur, worn soft at the corners in a way I was going to understand far too well in about 10 seconds. "She didn't find your card in any drawer, Elliot," Bianca said, and her voice had gone almost gentle, which was somehow the very worst part of it. "She hunted you. She researched you for months. She drove past 9 architects who could have looked at that house just fine to get all the way to the one she'd already decided she wanted. 14 years, 3 husbands, and you're just the next name on her list." I stared at the photographs on the hood of my truck. The young man on the diner steps had my shoulders. Had my bad summer haircut from a decade and a half ago. I had never once seen that particular picture in my life, which meant that somebody had taken it and then kept it, carefully, for 14 long years. "Ask her why she drove 2 hours," Bianca said, sliding the open folder an inch closer to my hand. "Go ahead. Ask her why, out of everyone, it had to be you. And here is the thing I have to be honest about, because I've been honest with you about everything else. In that one moment, on the hood of that truck, everything Camille had ever done in front of me quietly rearranged itself into something ugly. The hand on the doorframe, the way she'd chosen my house, my firm, my exact and particular self out of a whole list. The card in the drawer, which I now understood had never once been inside any drawer at all. Every soft, careful, patient thing about her turned, in the space of a single held breath, into evidence. A woman who had married and lost 3 men, circling a 4th, and I had walked straight into the middle of the drawing without ever once seeing the pencil lines underneath. I looked down at the matchbook again, Larkspur Diner, and for the first time in 14 years, I let myself remember that I had one exactly like it, in a drawer at home, at the bottom of a box I hadn't opened since before my marriage. I remembered the summer I was 21. I remembered a girl who worked the counter at a diner in a small town I'd been sent to survey a courthouse in, and how the 2 of us had spent 3 whole months acting like September was a rumor that would never come true. I remembered giving her a matchbook off that counter and telling her, like a boy, like an absolute fool in love, that it was a promise. And I remembered leaving for a program overseas I'd committed to long before I ever met her, and asking her to wait and write, and the letters that never once came, and coming home months later to find she'd already married someone else so fast it had felt like a door slamming shut in a house I'd been sure was mine. Her name back then hadn't been Ashford. It had been a married name I'd never learned. Over a maiden name I'd been too young and too proud and too wounded to hold on to, Camille. Bianca watched my whole face do all of this, and she smiled, satisfied, because she thought she was watching a man learn he'd been played for a fool. She had no earthly idea she was actually watching a man realize, 14 years too late, that he had just been found. I didn't call Camille that night, or the next one either. I sat in my quiet apartment with that old box open on the table in front of me and the two matchbooks I couldn't stop setting side by side, and I let the ugliest possible version of the story run itself all the way out until it finally collapsed under its own weight. Then I got in the truck and drove to Wybridge. She was on the porch when I came up the walk in the last of the evening light, and she saw it in my face the way she saw absolutely everything, fast and certain, and she stood up very straight, the way careful people stand when they've decided the leaving is finally, at long last, here. I set the folder down on the porch rail between us. The photographs, the circled name, the matchbook. "Bianca gave me this," I said. "She says you hunted me. She says I'm number 4. Camille didn't reach for the folder. She didn't cry, or explain too fast, or do any of the dozen things a guilty person does with their hands. She just looked out at the larkspur, bending in the evening wind, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so steady and so quiet that it broke something open in my chest. "I did come here on purpose," she said. "That part is true, and I want you to hear me say it out loud, because I am so tired of hiding inside true things." She wrapped her arms around herself against a wind that wasn't really cold. "The house is real. I really do have to either sell it or save it. That was never once a lie. I just used it. I used a true reason to get close to the one reason I could never let myself say." "Close to what?" I said. "The reason you couldn't say. You," she said, simply, like it was the easiest and the hardest word in the language at the very same time. "It was always you. It was you the whole time, Elliot." And then she told me the version of it I'd spent 14 years, not even knowing I was missing. That summer, she'd loved me the way you only ever get to love one time before you've learned to be afraid of the size of it. And when I left for that program overseas, she hadn't heard cowardice, or commitment, or plain bad timing in it. She'd heard the oldest sentence in her whole life, the one that got written into her before she was even old enough to read it back. People leave. So when the letters didn't come, and she was young and dead certain in the way that only the young and the wounded can be, she'd married the very first man who swore up and down that he would stay. And when he didn't, she'd married another one, and then another, chasing a single feeling she had only ever had once in her life, on the front steps of a diner, with a boy who gave her a matchbook off the counter and had the nerve to call it a promise. "They didn't leave because I'm hard to love," she said, and it was the first time all evening her voice actually shook. "They left because I never once, in 3 entire marriages, stopped comparing every one of them to a single summer I couldn't get back. I was never fully in the room with any of them. I gave them a woman who was always half turned toward a window, looking down a road, and the moment each of them figured that out, they left. Every man I have ever told the truth to has heard 3 husbands and started quietly reaching for his coat before I even finished the sentence." She finally turned and looked straight at me. "So I stopped waiting for the coat," she said. "I started handing it to them first. It hurts less when you're the one who opens the door. And I thought about the woman who would sit across a candle-lit table from me and whisper that exact same sentence over the wine she wouldn't touch. I understood, finally, standing on that porch, that she had been rehearsing that line her entire adult life, handing men a clean reason to go before they could ever get around to inventing one of their own. I reached into my jacket, and I took out my own matchbook, and I set it down on the rail right next to hers. 2 of them now, both navy blue, both worn soft at the corners, a small silver sprig of larkspur on each one, side by side on the railing while her grandmother's larkspur nodded and bent in the gathering dark. "You said men leave when they hear you've had 3 husbands," I said. "But I'm the one who left first, back in that summer. I left, and then I didn't fight the silence when it came, and I told myself for 14 years that you were the one who'd slammed the door on me. My own voice wasn't steady anymore either. Now, I came back. It took me way, way too long to do it, and I am sorry for every one of those wasted years. But I came back, Camille. and for one honest second, one single second, I felt the old wound in me lean hard toward the exit, the exact same way hers always had, whispering that this was far too much, that a smart man keeps his keys in his hand and his engine running. I felt how easy, how reasonable, it would be to leave right then and call the leaving wisdom. I stepped toward her instead. "You met the wrong men," I said. "You just never once met one who stayed. We did not fall into each other's arms out there on the porch. That is not how it happened, and I would never lie to you and tell you that it did. What happened instead was slower, and I have come to believe that slower is the only kind that ever really holds its shape." The first thing the two of us did together was kill Bianca's deal. Camille took the house off the market the very next morning, and without that one keystone parcel, her whole careful map simply fell apart in her hands. Bianca lost her development and her leverage in the very same week, and she left Weybridge the same way she had first arrived, sharp heels and a tailored coat, except this time there was no smile anywhere on her face. She had driven all the way out here to weaponize the truth, and the truth had gone and quietly decided to belong to us instead. I won't pretend I felt nothing at all watching her taillights leave that town for good. Mostly, what I felt was how impossibly far I had finally come from the man who had once rearranged his entire self just to keep her from going. Then Camille and I started, together, on the house. It was exactly the right pace for two people who had both spent their whole lives learning to expect the leaving. We didn't stand around making big speeches about the future. We talked about joists and plaster and lime wash, about whether the good oak buried under the water damage could be coaxed back to life, and every single weekend I drove west, and every single weekend that long drive felt a little less like distance and a little more like the plain shape of going home. She had learned to be careful in exactly the way I had learned to be quiet, and it turned out that careful and quiet, given enough patient Saturdays, build something remarkably strong together. We sanded floors on our knees, side by side, not saying very much of anything. I taught her how to read the grain of old wood with her thumb, and she taught me, without ever once making a lesson out of it, how to stay in a room with another person and not spend the whole time bracing for the sound of the door. There were setbacks, the way there always are with an old house and with old wounds both. A section of subfloor we'd thought was sound turned out to be rotten straight through, and we tore it all out and started that room over without a word of complaint from either of us, because by then we both understood that starting over carefully is not the same thing as failing. Some Saturdays we barely spoke at all, just worked, and the quiet between us stopped being the nervous kind and became the other kind, the kind you can lean your whole weight against. She flinched, sometimes. Of course she did. She'd catch herself in the middle of a sentence, the old fear surfacing up through her like cold water. And once, near the end of a long dusty day with sawdust in both our heads of hair, she went very still in the fading light and said, almost to herself, "You'd be number 4. She said it like a warning, like one last honest chance to run that she was offering me out of pure lifelong habit. I put the sander down on the floor. "I'm not a number," I told her, and I meant it all the way down. "I'm not the next one in a line. I'm the last door you're ever going to have to knock on." And then I watched her decide, slowly, weekend by weekend, board by sanded board, to actually let herself believe me. That, right there, was the real restoration. The house was only ever the part of it you could photograph. A year and a half later, the Ashford house was fully alive again. The oak floors glowed the deep gold color of honey wherever the afternoon light came across them. The hand-built staircase somebody had raised 140 years ago stood straight and sure and proud. Out on the porch, the larkspur came back that spring the way it always had, whether anyone tended it or not, blue and violet and impossibly stubborn, and Camille planted a whole second row of it along the front walk, so that there would be a little more of it every single year we stayed. And inside, right by the kitchen door, in a plain frame I had made myself out of one salvaged scrap of the original oak, we hung 2 matchbooks, navy blue, silver larkspur, worn soft at the corners, side by side behind the glass, exactly the way they had once sat together on the porch railing the night I finally stopped running. We take our coffee out on those front steps most mornings now. 2 cups. The sharp smell of new paint has long since faded down into the older, better, deeper smell of a house that is genuinely lived in again. Somewhere down the street, the Larkspur Diner still switches its half-lit neon sign on at dawn, and its little bell above the door still rings out when somebody pushes through it, and I don't get that old tight feeling in my chest anymore when I drive past. Now I just lift a hand and wave. She still, some days, goes quiet in a way I have learned by heart to recognize. A fear that took a whole lifetime to build does not come all the way undone in a single good season, and I never expected it to. On those days I don't say anything clever or reassuring, I just stay in the room with her. I make sure she can hear me, plainly, not leaving. The staying, it turns out, is the entire sentence, not the vows and not the speeches. Just a man who is still there in the morning, pouring the second cup, choosing the very same door he chose the day before, and the day before that. I spent 14 years living 2 hours east of the best thing that ever happened to me, telling myself the whole distance was nothing but chance. Camille spent 3 long marriages handing good men the exit before they could ever manage to find it on their own. The 2 of us were both so completely sure that the leaving was the ending of the story that neither one of us had ever once stayed put long enough to find out it was only ever the beginning of it. The house we saved is the house we live in now. The larkspur her grandmother planted comes back every year, whether we remember to tend it or not, and so, I have finally learned, do the people who were always meant to. Some of us just take the very long way home. I used to think staying was the easy part, the obvious part. You love someone, so you stay, and I never could understand the men who somehow found that simple thing so hard to do. Camille taught me I'd had it backwards. For some people, staying is the bravest thing they'll ever do, and for others, the ones who've been left enough times to stop expecting anything else, being stayed for is a thing they quietly stopped believing was possible. She'd spent her whole life whispering her worst truth across every candlelit table, not to be honest, but to hand a man a door before he could go looking for one himself. She was so certain of the leaving that she rehearsed it. She practiced her own abandonment until she was good at it. She'd had 3 husbands who left. I only ever wanted to be the one who didn't. The house still stands, and so do we, and the larkspur still comes back every spring the way the people who are truly meant for you eventually do, even when it takes them the long road and the slow years to get there. So let me ask you something. Wherever you are tonight, whoever you might still be bracing yourself to lose, if someone laid their whole painful history in front of you and handed it over as a reason to leave, would you take the door they offered? Or would you be the one who finally stayed? And do you think Camille was hiding a lie all those weeks on that porch, or protecting a truth she'd been hurt too many times to hope for out loud? Tell me down in the comments, because I read them, and I think about them more than I probably should. And if Elliot and Camille got under your skin tonight, hit that like button, and subscribe so the next story finds you. Then leave a comment with your answer to the only question that ever really mattered. Were they the wrong men, or was she just early?